So let's kick off. Welcome to this session about our new audience development playbook. It's what I'm thinking of as being a soft launch in as much as we're still playing around with some of these ideas and seeing how they work, and we're building on them, and we're building the resources that sit around them and so on. So we're seeing you as being a group of testers and people with whom we can have an interesting conversation about whether these resources are useful, what else we need, the kinds of challenges that we are all facing. So, our plan for the day this afternoon looks a little bit like this. Oh no, skip back. So I thought it might be useful just to take an FAQ approach to the presentation today. So I'm going to walk us through some obvious questions, partly because this is the first of a number of different events that we have planned, all three events that are happening over the next few months. This one is very much the intro. It's quite straight information forward. But it will be followed up by 4 quite interactive workshops if you want to get your hands dirty and start playing with some of the tools and so on in the future. So this is quite a straightforward session. We have built in some opportunities to have a bit of a discussion. And so we're very interested to know if you have questions or comments or thoughts. Let's try and make it into a conversation as much as possible. So we will use the chat. Please feel free to put things in there. I have several colleagues on this call with me. So just pop any thoughts you have in there. And if you want to speak directly, again, just pop your hand up and somebody will be looking out. We'll make sure that we do that. Bear with me, I have included a little bit of my favorite Mentimeter tool as a way of getting some feedback from you. Some of you might know that tool, some of you might not, but we'll kick off with a little bit of discussion about what people are interested in and so on, just to give me an idea, and we'll do that in a moment. As I say, though, the idea is to walk through a few FAQs about the playbook, what it is, what it's for, etc. We should have time for a little break about halfway in. And then we will definitely finish by 3:30 this afternoon. As I say, hopefully only the beginning of a conversation because there's more to say and do after that. Hope that all makes sense. Yes. Shall we move on and dive in a little bit? Welcome all joining us. So I just thought, I know many of you will know the audience agency a little bit or quite well, but some people might not do. So I was just going to remind you who we are, or in other words, actually who's behind the audience playbook. I think it's worth saying that I think we're about 48 people at the audience agency at the moment. And I think pretty much everyone in one way or another will have contributed to what's in that playbook. And just for those of you that don't know, we are quite a mixed bunch. Many of us people who have worked in the cultural sector, museum sector, and the arts sector, but we really are dedicated to not just doing audience research and other kinds of research, but trying to put that research into practice. So we sometimes talk about ourselves as being a research, do and learn agency, although I will tell you that some of my colleagues hate that term, so I'm not allowed to use it officially. We do a lot of work around audiences, broadly audience development, but also thinking about cultural policy and particularly the role of engagement and participation in cultural policy. Many of you will know that we work with literally hundreds of arts and cultural organisations, mostly in the UK, but a lot internationally as well. It's delightful to see some of our international colleagues here today. Very welcome indeed. We've learned so much from doing this work through exchange. We do hold some quite interesting national data and research about audiences broadly. And in some ways, the playbook leans into making the most of some of that information that we hold. But our origins as an organization were always about being an enabler of collaboration. So helping people come together to share data, to share learning, to share insights. And the playbook really is a manifestation of that. As I say, it's very much something that has come out of our work with many, many organizations over the last 10 years. It also adheres to our overall byline. The thing we talk about ourselves when we're talking about ourselves internally and externally is to say that while we're very keen on data and we're very interested in the evidence and what that's telling us about what's really going on in the world, we also like to think that we're really people-centered and actually we're using that information to help us get closer to what really matters to people, both in terms of colleagues in the sector, but also, of course, our audiences, users, stakeholders, and participants. So that's us behind the playbook. But as I say, it's not just us. It is linked to all the things we do. Of course, audience development and participation are very much at the heart of it. But recently, we've been thinking much more about our work across 5 different pillars. So we also do a lot around AI and digital transformation, lots of creative placemaking, of which, of course, thinking about audiences and participants right in the center of that. We do a lot of evaluation and impact studies, but a lot of that work is trying to work out what's working in audience development. And a lot of our thinking from evaluation is reflected in the playbook too. And finally, as I say, we do quite a fair bit of work in the policy arena, trying to connect up the dots between what people are doing on the ground and the policy frameworks within which we're working. So the playbook is a nice golden thread that comes across all of those things. As I say, it also links into some of our data tools. Some of you will know our audience answers tools. They're ways of using research mechanisms to look at who your audience is, ways of sharing data across lots of organizations, and particularly our audience spectrum segmentations, which tells us a little bit about every household in the UK's likelihood to be a certain kind of arts engager. So we're using these tools, we're referencing these tools in the playbook, but I do want to stress that a lot of the techniques and tools and processes we're suggesting can work with any kind of audience data and any kind of segmentation. So it's not particularly geared to audience spectrum, but we have used that in all the examples. I hope I'm making sense so far. I'm just seeing lots of lovely people introducing themselves. But if anyone's going, what are you talking about on especially, slow down, please just flag it. I can see Catherine here monitoring the chat for me. So you're going to go, stop if I'm going too fast, which is my usual preference. Okay, so finally, I think I just want to stress that although, as I say, our 48 colleagues and people who've worked with us for many years outside of the organisation have also had a huge impact on this. So we have worked with literally hundreds of organisations on using these tools. As I say, what we haven't done is necessarily written it down before, but we have worked, I think I've worked out that I've done something like 60 workshops in the last year that all relate directly to using the tools and techniques in this playbook. We haven't written it down as a whole, which is why we're particularly keen to get your feedback and say, is this working? We know lots of things won't be working yet, so we're very keen to hear what you have to say. But it really is the result of that collaboration with our colleagues, our partners, our clients, participants in lots of learning programs. We've done lots of trainee programs and mentoring people doing this program. So all of their ideas in a way feed into some of our thinking here. Right. Now, next thing though, before I bang on any more about what's in the playbook, and I will be going on about it for the rest of the session, I just wanted to stop for a moment and have a little bit of interaction with you just to find out a little bit more about what might be interesting in a playbook from your point of view, and particularly what you might be interested to get out of sessions like this. So if I can bear with you, I don't know if all of you know how to use Menti, but you can either point your phone at that QR code, which will take you through automatically into the Menti, which is essentially like a sort of live survey tool. Or if not, and you want to do it on your browser, you can just go to menti.com in a different window and then plug in that number, and then you can join in. You don't have to, it's not compulsory, but it would be fun. And I would make me feel confident that you're paying attention. So I am now going to stop sharing this screen and I'm going to go into the Menti and see how many people are with me. Are you ready? So there's a QR code. It's going to pop up again in a second. Don't worry. So I have to come out of this, I think, for a moment. I have to go in here. Marvelous. Share again. Oh, look at that. We're in. So my first question for you all, I think I need to go into, how do I get rid of all this gump to move all my screens around? Move that right. Not quite sure how to get my whole screen going here, but there you go. We'll just have to go with it. So my first question for you all, who's managed to have a look at the playbook yet? Now we know lots of people haven't because you haven't all got a copy of it yet. So no worries, it's just to give me a bit of an idea. I'm gratified to see that no one's saying they don't know. No shame in that. I'll tell you why that's there. It's because my brilliant head of quantitative research, who is our lead on all these things, says you must always include a don't know in any multiple choice. So I've done it correctly, but it's just testing his wake this afternoon. Fantastic. So most of you haven't read it yet. That's good news. So you can't pick me up on anything. So that's really good. But quite a few of you have. So that's also nice to know as well. Okay. I'm giving the last four of you a chance to get in there. So I'm hoping that's all makes sense. If anyone's struggling with the Menti, just drop Megan and Catherine a note in the chat and they can give you some more instructions if you're struggling. Okay, so majority of people haven't had a chance to look at it yet. That is dead useful to know. So I'm doing all the things I'm going to be talking about, tuning into my audience and finding out where they're at. Right, next thing, next question. This is a tricky one because you've got to do some thinking now. I'm sorry, it's early in the process to make you think. I beg your pardon. So what I'd like you to do is to tell me a little bit about what you might be hoping to find out today. And I can either try and gear what I'm saying in that direction, or we can find another way of doing it later. So do tell me what might be interesting to find out today. First steps about where to start. Excellent. That's what I like to hear. I think I've made this really complicated by giving you a chance to vote. So once people have come up with some suggestions, you also have an opportunity to go, yes, I like the sound of that, but you don't have to. And you can, of course, skip this stage as well. Great. First steps about where to start, how this can help with my existing audience development strategy. Great. So in progress. Yeah, what's it all about? And is it worth reading? I think is the covert part of that question. Excellent. Yes, what it has to do, just a general introduction before you dive in. Best practice, how to greatly integrate the tool into what you're already doing. Yeah, I think that's a really good one. I hope that if not today, then some of our other sessions are going to be very much geared around that. How to engage with diverse audiences, brilliant. I think that is at the heart of it is the idea that we might be needing to talk to many different kinds of audiences in our work and how we try to manage and make sense of that. Yeah, what's the point? Good. A refresh to our strategy. Excellent. Hope you can all see these things, some really interesting stuff. If there's anything that looks particularly interesting to you, please do feel free to give it a tick. Advice on growing audiences, how to identify potential audiences and create a strategy to help develop and engage them. End to end, that's what I like to hear. Fantastic. How do we change our program and practice to fit our audiences? That's such a core question. Whether we've achieved it or not, I don't know, but I think that is one of the big questions, that person, that we were hoping to introduce in the way we think about the playbook. Yes, and what's new in the playbook? Yes, absolutely. There are some new things in the playbook, and I will be talking about them. Fantastic. Lots of really useful stuff here. I have to say, my colleague Megan is particularly keen to take some of these things away so we can start thinking about what we might need to add, different ways we can articulate what's going on, and other tools and resources that we can put around it. So this is super useful. Brilliant. Thank you. New approaches to develop our existing strategy. There's a few of those, aren't there? Excellent. Okay, great. If there's anything you particularly like the look of and you think, yes, that chimes with me, just give a little bit of put a little note on it. I think you can I might have moved you on, so you're not able to do that question. I'm sorry. I think you have to go at my speed, I'm afraid. Doing a bit of voting here. Let's see if anyone's come up with anything. I think that's thrown everybody. Oh, no. There we go. Great. I think I may have overcomplicated it with all the lovely new tools in Mentimeter. What fun. Let's go on to the next slide. Here's a question for you all, really. So this question around where are you with audience development? And I've got 4 questions, 3 of which work brilliantly as a slider, and one of which is a bit rubbish, but Dan's not looking. So first question, I have a strong understanding of audience development. Where would you put yourself on that scale? The second one, I feel confident about putting an audience development strategy in place. Where do you feel on that one? We're obviously looking for averages across the whole group. My organization has an effective audience strategy up and running, or we're working on a new one. how far into, I suppose that last question isn't terribly well phrased, but how far into your new strategy are you, I suppose, is what's implied by that. So either you strongly disagree, in other words, I don't have a strong understanding, I don't feel confident at one end, or you strongly agree and say, absolutely, I feel very confident, thank you. Marvelous. I'm going to wait for everybody to get into this. Oh, good. Interesting to see that lots of people are working on a new one. I have to say, I assumed that might be why people were popping it in today, but you shouldn't assume. So it's good to see there's a balance of people who actually, it was interesting from those previous comments that people were talking about wanting to adapt and tweak their existing strategy, or whether actually starting completely from scratch or on a new one or refresh, etc., etc. So that sounds really good. Brilliant. Got a couple of things coming up here. Still out in front, slight winner there about being particularly interested in getting a new strategy off the ground. I think that's great. Okay. And actually, I think our instinct is that it might be to do with where we are in the funding cycle in England, at least. But I guess quite a lot of people's audience development strategy is slightly out of date if they were doing it for recent funding rounds. I know not everybody here by a long way is an Arts Council of England regularly funded organisation, but I guess for organisations who are, that's often the trigger. I suppose we're making a plea a little bit in the playbook to say, don't wait till then, do it for you. Okay, brilliant. And I think we've got another question. Which last two questions for you. Do any of these look like challenges that you've experienced in trying to do your audience development? Firstly, getting or using audience data. Secondly, getting the whole organization involved. We know audience development is not something that one team or one individual can do. It has to be something that involves everybody. It can often be a struggle. And finally, keeping it going. So not just measuring progress over time, but actually keeping going with it. One of the things we think probably happens is that, we're often involved with creating the initial plan, but we're not sure how much people actually stick with it over time. So I'm really curious about this one. Really interesting. You can vote for all four, by the way. Oh, that's quite surprising. They're all pretty equal at the moment. Making and measuring progress, though, is out there in the lead, I think. That's really interesting. Oh, catching up, though. Okay. Just give it a couple more seconds. My last question is going to be what your something else is. So just be thinking ahead on that one. If you were a something else person, I'm interested to know, or indeed if you think there are other challenges that you can't quite articulate here, that'd be really interesting. And then that's our last question, and we'll go back to actually looking at what's going on in the playbook. Just checking the timings. Great. I think most of you who are going to vote have voted on that one. So really that making and measuring progress over time, keeping it going, I think that's really interesting. I think there's some things in the playbook that are about that, but I think it's something that we could definitely think about beefing up. And in fact, we've been working with quite a lot of organizations recently thinking about how do you keep momentum going, especially because we have this challenge that many of us, if you work in a museum setting, you might be thinking one exhibition to the next, or a gallery setting. If you work in a performing arts place, you might be thinking one program to the next, one season to the next. Sometimes it's really hard to keep these long-term strategies going when actually we tend to start thinking in smaller units of our own activity. How do you switch the focus around? So quite a lot of the thinking about the playbook has been trying to say, well, if we can get away from that, if we can start thinking about how we put some of our audiences in the middle of our planning, and then see how different parts of our programming are working for them, that can help us to flip it. But I think it's something we can probably strengthen a bit. Great. So my very last question for you is just relating to that something else. Are there any other challenges that you particularly observed, or indeed things that you found very helpful? Last chance to do a free text box response to this before we return to looking at what's in the playbook, and I can slightly steer around your thoughts on this front. Oh, yes, the big one that I forgot. The finding the time and capacity thing. Yes, of course. Time and resources. I've forgotten that one. That's a bit stupid because I really do know that is the big killer, isn't it? And I think that's such a true one. Lack of specialist knowledge in our tiny team. I do think pressure on cultural organizations these days, particularly big ones and small ones for different reasons, is so, you're supposed to know about everything from data protection to performing rights, etc. There are so many things that we need to know about rather specialist areas. And I hope, don't know, I hope that actually this, in a way, the playbook is designed to demystify, despite the fact it looks like 73 pages, which looks like a big read. Most of its boxes, I promise, and it's just a dip in and dip out kind of resource. So please don't be frightened of it. Okay. Responding in tiny capacity, yeah, it's a big one. Look, funds, it does that we do need some resources to do that. I think time is a big one. I think sometimes we beat ourselves up that we've got to have perfect audience research. Again, the playbook says let's use what we have got and be aware of the limitations of it, but start with what we've got and try and build up on it a bit. So again, trying to reduce the idea that we have to have a lot of resource to get behind it. We can get started with something quite small. Software, interesting. There are some software things you could be using, but again, I think we've got some, this is quite hands-on, quite paper-based if we want it to be. Changing audiences, genuinely, yes, exactly. It's easy to do the things and actually not see very much change, which I think is the real challenge of some of these things. The theory and the practice and what actually happens don't always join up for a bunch of reasons that is probably the subject of another conversation we need to have. Place-based organization, yeah, consistency. Everyone collects data in different ways, and it's really difficult to build a picture all together. Absolutely. That's an interesting one to take on. Yes. So actually, the pressure is on to spend the money on bringing in on the financial targets, except and so on. So when we think about audience development and all the different objectives we might be trying to reach for our audiences, that can be difficult. Although I would say that an audience development plan, if you're very clear that actually what you need to do is to make more money, I think sometimes that's a really good thing to prioritize your objectives. Really works well. Great. Over-reliance on some really good things about very specific things around data here. So I think we're going to be able to pick up some of those things as well. So I think quite a lot of quite specialist things around data, which our first follow-on session is going to be about using data to get started. So some really good steers here. But a lot of the things you've talked about here, hopefully we will at least are going to be touching on and to come back to in a bit more detail in a moment. So thank you so much for doing that. I'm going to come back and actually talk a little bit more about the playbook as expected now, but super useful just to tune in to what you're thinking about. So let's come back to looking at the playbook itself. Thank you. Really generous of you. Very useful. It will come back. It'll come back. You planted some good seeds. So what is this playbook of which we speak? Let's have a quick look. So I think it's worth saying that why have we used the term playbook rather than a guide? So some of you may know that the most popular resource we've had on our website for many, many years was our old guide to creating an effective audience development plan. And the reason we've called it a playbook is because we really want to get away from something that looks like a guide. So it is a refresh of our original guide, but it introduces several different things. So it like that guide, it is a sort of simplified, and I stress simplified, deliberately simplified step-by-step process. But in this case, we're kind of going for processes which are a little bit less straitjacketed. It brings in some of the kind of traditional thinking around audience development, but it's really geared towards helping you develop quite an individualized approach. There are lots of templates and examples of prompts because we see this as being something which is a set of tools which are really playful and collaborative. They're really designed to help you work closely with your colleagues on generating both a common understanding, but actually new ideas about how you might want to do something. It does, as I said earlier on, it does work quite well with audience agency tools, but please don't be limited by that. You can use it, and we'll be beefing up the instructions about how to do that. But it can work with lots of other things as well. So don't be put off if the fact you're not using our tools. You've just got a little bit of audience data. It will help you, and we'll come on and have a little look at that. So the big difference really is that this is a much more playful approach. It's much more about tools which help you to have discussions, tools which help you to work collaboratively, and really about a series of plays rather than a long written up, documented plan that sits there for several years and you don't look at. So the idea is something that's much more live, it's much more iterative, it's small, something that you come back to on a regular basis. That at least is the intention. As I say, it is very much a beta version. Although we work with this toolkit all the time, we haven't written it up in this way. And what we want to know is it working? I can already see lots of things that I think we can improve, and that's what we want to hear from you. So your feedback is super useful to us. The other thing I think it's worth saying is that we were thinking in quite what's traditionally called these days, what's traditionally called a kind of waterfall method, where, thinking about a sort of a strategy you put in place, it takes several years for anything to actually happen. We know that audience development in the real world does not happen in this sort of linear way at all. It happens much more like this. And again, we've tried to build in tools which enable you to do that much more easily. We've tried to sort of make you feel confident about the fact that iteration and going around in circles and dropping things that don't quite work is fine. And if that's not coming through strongly enough, we need to beef that up. So just thinking a little bit about who it's for. So I think broadly speaking, it's very much for any cultural organization, but the emphasis here, as always with audience development, is it's not for an organization who's perfectly happy with the audiences that they have at the moment. The point about audience development is it is about growth and it is about change. So you only really need an audience development plan if you spotted something that you would like to change. And I think that's the important thing to remember, that this is not about bringing audiences in. This is about changing your audiences for one reason or another. So, the classic way, every definition of audience development around the world will tend to sort of use, this has become very much the sort of received wisdom idea that audience development is about change, and it's about essentially these four different kinds of change. So essentially that you have both existing audiences and existing products or programs or ways of doing things and activities, and you are trying to find a balanced way of retaining and optimizing your existing audiences, or your established program, or you might decide actually we're done with those. We want to move on. We want to do something completely different. But you need to know which box you're operating in, and/or, oops, going the wrong way. It might be about growing your audience, trying to find more people like your existing audience who'll be interested in what you do already. It might be about taking your existing audiences on a journey and deepening perhaps the relationship or their experience, but going further with that existing audience. Or indeed, it might be the most difficult one of all, diversing what you do in order to reach new audiences. Because the one thing we've learned is that you're highly unlikely to be able to reach audiences you've never met before, simply by telling them that you're there or it's here. For the most part, if you want to attract a completely different audience, or the evaluation tells us, you'll probably have to do quite different things. So most of us are kind of caught not knowing quite where we are in these boxes. One of the first things we ask you to do is to think really carefully about, can you be in all the boxes at once? Do you need to be? Where does the emphasis need to go? And perhaps you might want to tackle different places with different audiences at different times. So this is a really important, not only is it important conceptually, but it's a really useful planning tool that actually does pop up as it did in the guide, but it's also in the playbook, because it's the foundation really of how we think about audience development. But I just want to go back for a moment to think about who else, the other things to do with who it's for. So we think the playbook is useful for you if you are trying to build audiences over time with a changing program or a permanent collection, etc., etc. But it could also be used. Many of the plays can be used to build a new audience for a project or program. So you can use it for a one-off. It's more geared towards slow developmental change over time, but lots of the tools are really useful if you're just getting started and you're just doing it for a one-off thing. It should be helping you to think about the different competing objectives that you might have. So how you're balancing financial objectives, how you're thinking about the social objectives that you may have as an organization. Perhaps you have creative or learning objectives as well that you want to promote. It should be helping you think about, well, how am I thinking about audiences with all of these different outcomes that our organization is hoping to achieve? It's very much, as I say, about a set of tools which are useful to teams who need to work together. So we often see that, we see an audience development plan that's sitting in the education team or with the marketing team, but the education team is doing something else over here. So this is very much about programmers, marketers, education people, fundraisers, planners coming together in an aligned way. The tools are really geared to help you to do that as well as you can. So one of the things we suggest, you don't have to do it, but one of the things that we suggest is that if you want to drive an audience development process using these tools, it might really help you to set up a small group, a small task group, but really importantly, made up from people from those different teams with those different understanding. And really important to have people who are having daily interactions with the audiences, your participants in that group. So it might be front of house in some way. But it's also quite handy to have somebody who says, oh, I don't have anything to do with the audiences, mate. We found some of the most useful people in those task forces are people like some from your finance team, because they bring a different perspective and some of the sort of other impressions or points of view that exist elsewhere in the organization. So one of the things we suggest is think about getting a little team together with different perspectives, different skills, and different points of view to work on this together. Right, we've already looked a little bit at the, oops, don't want to do that. We've looked at audience development, there we go. So I'm going to, just before we have a little break, I'm going to think a little bit about why we have refreshed the playbook and what's different about it and why. And really, this is just zooming out from our immediate challenges and thinking a little bit about the big picture and some of the audience challenges that we face at the moment in a very changing world. So what's new? A couple of you said you came on today hoping to find out what's new. I've already said there's a lot more about collaboration here. So yes, about collaboration with our colleagues, but also a lot of these tools and techniques are really designed to help you, importantly, to collaborate with your audiences. There's a lot in here about putting the focus of audience development activity on developing perhaps changed, new, or adapted experiences than the ones you offer at the moment. So essentially, once you found out more about your audience, how might you be thinking about trying to adapt with and for those those audiences? So rather than starting with the very good ideas and things that we want to do as an organization, this slightly invites you not to be any less innovative or inspirational, but to move away, to start thinking about understanding audience needs as being the springboard for that creativity and innovation inside your audience. It also invites us to be open to planning for constant change. So again, thinking more cyclically, thinking a little bit about bringing some of these techniques into the play all the time, just the way we do things around here, rather than just doing them on a kind of once every 3 years basis. And I think, again, that's to do with changes in our environment as much as it is the changing, as much as it's based on what we know works, if you like. So there's more in here about little plans that you can put into action and learn and scale as you go. So definitely we're trying to encourage that way of working. Whether it does it or not, I don't know, but that's the intention. So why is it we are suggesting that people work more in this way? Why this kind of a refresh? So as I said, I'll just go back a moment and think a little bit about the changing environment that we're working in. So I guess the big one is that our audiences are increasingly unpredictable and not necessarily responding to the old models. So everything from the way people behave in our spaces to the volatility of when they choose to sign up for things or book for them, to really strange, eclectic and niche tastes emerging for reasons that we don't always completely understand. In other words, I'm hearing in many, many different ways that our audiences are getting harder to predict. They're sort of more volatile. And the most important thing to remember here is that we are often inviting audiences who live in a completely very fast turning world to engage with models that in some cases are 200 years old in our cases, that we do certain performances at certain times, we have certain expectations of people's habits. People live in a very personalized world now where actually formats are constantly changing around them, and that is increasingly their expectation. So if we are not able to innovate at the speed at which people's tastes and interests are changing, we are in trouble, it seems to me. So that's one of the reasons about thinking about around just being more willing to adapt as we're getting data at our fingertips that's telling us that's not working, could be working better. Just in a way, building in the willingness to test new ideas out on a kind of constant basis, right? The big one, of course, is to do with generational change. Some of you will have heard me talking about this in the past, but one of the things we can see really clearly from the trend data is that The Gen Zs, the Gen As are, and even millennials are not necessarily replicating the behaviors of their parents as they reach new life stages. So in the past, it is true that people would start going to see more classical music when they reached the age of 47 and suddenly had an empty nest. Those kinds of trends we can see really clearly are not happening. So we're seeing, again, very, very different sort of trends happening. Of course, it's partly driven by changes in the digital world, but it's also to do with a whole range of different things to do with young people and their expectations. And some of them, let's have a little look at what those things are. But again, this idea that people particularly expect to be much more at the center of their own cultural creative experiences. So I think this is one of the big changes that we're seeing around us, is that people are not consuming culture in the same way. So we're seeing, I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing a big drop of what we keep calling the sitting down arts, particularly those ones that have very formal sets of principles sitting around how you engage with them and so on, but people wanting to do things much more on their own terms. One of the things that we're really interested in terms of digital, for example, is this idea that one of the things we've observed is that, and this is through a number of different studies, is the idea that as people are surrounded by content, 24/7 at their fingertips, sometimes if you're my kids, watching things on 15 screens at the same time as doing their homework, that actually this whole thing about multi-channel, always there, great huge amounts of variety, is that not only do we have to play into people's sense about fear of missing out, so-called FOMO. My colleagues, I think, coined this term, this sort of term of fear of going out. So when you do go out, it needs to be something very, very special. You need to feel that you are taking part in something that you can take a photo of yourself doing, that you're part of. You need to be part of something out there, important and interesting. This puts a sort of a whole set of pressures on us about understanding what that might mean. That we're moving away from just being providers of everyday content to something perhaps very different. So we need to be able to understand what that actually means from our audience's perspective. I think this idea, this is a completely stupid thing to say in some ways, and in others, I think but it's also really important. So I come back to this point, this idea that we are all makers now. Of course, human beings have been makers since forever. It's sort of nonsense to suggest that we're not, but I think there is definitely something around, particularly those next generations, expecting to participate in creativity in different ways. So one of the things that comes up all the time in surveys of audiences and participants is, if you ask younger people, they're much, much more likely to talk about themselves as being a creative person, interested in doing creative things. So there's something about this pressure on us, I think, to be a channel for individuals' creativity. This particular picture, I'm not sure how well you can see, but it's from a place in Singapore where we've been having a lot of these conversations recently. It's a place called the Dragon Bridge. It's a fantastic bridge. It just goes across the way to the botanical gardens, but there are these huge mirrors all the way across the Dragon Bridge, and the whole Dragon Bridge is full of the youth, all kind of doing a lot of kind of performative dancing in front of all of these, and taking photos and little films of themselves, but making work in public, watching each other. It's like this amazing sort of hub of being in their own creative space. So simple kind of ideas about how do we tune into that? How do we become something a little bit different? And finally, there's all the really big stuff around, I think, this sense that many cultural organizations, most of us, I think, feel more and more of a responsibility to those communities left behind. I think, we're shifting what it means to be a public cultural organization these days. Even if you're a small one, I think we're very much about, we see ourselves as having a civic responsibility. And as the gap between haves and have-nots changes, I think we have to be very, very alert to the needs of those who are excluded for multiple reasons. We have to take that on ourselves a little bit, because for sure the rest of society isn't necessarily looking. And finally, I think there's this huge question about what are we becoming as organizations? So by 2050, it's quite possible that we will no longer just be content providers. There are lots of those out there. Maybe the responsibility on us is much more about being the meaning makers, much more on us about being the kind of the brokers of different kinds of relationships, being the kind of the keepers, if you like, of people being able to come together and tackle some of these issues. So I think our role as public cultural organizations is changing. We've got this whole bunch of things happening in the world, and we have to know what our response to some of these things might be, and what our job to be a kind of broker of social justice in these places is. And I know that sounds crazy, but we've already seen in quite a lot of our research with with younger generations, you can see this big difference in the expectation that cultural organisations are taking these things on board. People are saying, like, whereas older people might be very interested in climate change, they don't necessarily expect their local theatre or gallery to be, up there doing something about it. Whereas young generations definitely do think that's part of what we should be about. So again, this shifting role, if we are taking on a new role in society, how do we get closer to the people with whom we're doing that? Lots of issues for us to think about there. So this is why it seems to me that when we think about audience development, we need to think about doing something where we're much more closely linked in with who our audiences are. So I'm going to suggest that we have a very, very quick break now. Just a quick 5 minutes, if that sounds okay. Because I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you. And when we come back, what I'd like you to think about while you go and make that cup of tea, which I'm going to rush to do, is how does some of I know I was talking really big picture there, talking about what might be happening in 2050. And I know we're all thinking about what's happening this year, this week in our organizations, but I would love to know how some of these things resonate for you and what audience challenges and opportunities you really think you're grappling to address at the moment. Then we can sort of think a little bit about how we use the playbook to get to grips with those things. So that's my question for after the break. But for now, take 5 minutes. And let's get back together again at 14:50. Brilliant. Well, I hope some of you got just a little bit of moment there just for a breather. Great. Let us continue. So I was just a moment just to linger and just sort of check in really about any particular audience development challenges. Quite a few people mentioned in that earlier Mentimeter exercise that they were looking perhaps to diversify their audiences in some way. But any particular, now thinking less about our practice and some of the challenges actually getting things done, but are there particular audience opportunities or indeed challenges that you're hoping to address in some of your audience development planning at the moment? I'm just really curious to know, because I think there's something around what we're hoping to achieve by doing our audience development, which is really important for thinking about how we use these tools. So I don't know if anyone has got any thoughts that they'd like to share in the chat or would like to speak to. I'll give you a moment to consider, but I won't force it if no one's got anything in particular want to share. Yes, yeah. Oh, hi, John. Yes, that's that thing around. I think we've seen it. You just. I don't know if anyone's had a chance to read the touring report that we've finally published for the Arts Council, but lots of interesting trend data there about the sort of the way in which traditional drama is sort of really, the profile of audiences for that is really changing its popularity, which is it's those kinds of things, and none of us are quite sure why some things work and why they don't. And I think that's the point really is for me that we are talking very directly with our audiences. Yeah. The only way really. And it seems that sometimes these things are very localized. We see lots of differences around the country, for example. So again, this sort of thing about just being closer and more in dialogue feels as though it's really important. Anyone else? Any resonances? I can see we're going to just get on with it and tell us what's in this. What's going on in the playbook. Well, look, I'm going to leave you with that thought. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what's in the playbook now and how it's actually working. And then at the end, though, I would love to just hear a little bit more from you about what kinds of things you'd find useful. Again, particular challenges that you're looking at. So do please talk to us if you'd like to, and we'll save that for the end and just crack on and do a little bit looking at the playbook itself. Now, I think I'm right in saying if you don't have it already, Megan, what do you need to do to get a copy?
Oh, I've got the link in the chat. There's just a little form there that you just need to fill in, and I will send you a copy by the end of today.
The only reason we're doing that is not because we don't want to make it widely accessible to everyone. It's just useful to have a little tiny bit of data captured. Do you hate that sort of that data is a barrier? Hope not. But anyway, you'll it's just, I mean, partly because for us this is all about having some sort of dialogue, right? So shall we dive back in again? I am going to. Ooh, sorry, Abigail, I missed that one there. How to replicate success with an ever-changing exhibition program. I think it's such a big core thing, and I've just been doing a little bit of work with a couple of organizations looking at how with this sort of rapidly, how you get off the hamster wheel. In fact, I was doing some really interesting work with a group of organizations in Ireland, and we were talking about how you get off the hamster wheel, stand back enough to think about long-term change of your audiences when we're on this kind of constant conveyor belt of new programs that need promoting, audiences bringing in. It's all amazing stuff, but it's like, how do you sort of get that balance right? And I think it's something that there are some solutions to, but they're not easy, and something that we should be sharing more practice about. It's a really interesting point. Okay, I've got to screen my. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. Share your screen and blimey, right? Okay, here we go. So we're no longer in a break. We've had sort of had that conversation. So just so back to my original points, really, there that actually, if in this frighteningly fast changing world in which people's opinions are difficult, niches emerge, people change around us, our communities are changing, who actually lives around us is changing, the catchment areas are changing, people's expectations are changing. What do we do? So, broadly speaking, I suppose that we're talking about a way of working that does something a bit like this. So, we get away from thinking, I've got this thing I've got to try and get some people interested in, and we try and flip it on its head. You know this because we've been talking about this for years, but I suppose this is an attempt, the playbook is an attempt to say, okay, well, what do we actually do in practice if we're trying to get away from that product-led mindset into a more people-centered mindset? What do we do? So I guess the first stage is like we do need to use the data that we collect, not for reporting to our funders. We need to say, we need to kind of get to know our audiences in every possible which way. We need to think about them, yes, in numerical terms. We need to know, are there enough of them? But we also need to know what's really making them tick. We need to think about them qualitatively as well. In other words, we need to immerse ourselves in everything that we can think of about learning about our audiences. Now, if you're a small organization, that might just be about going out there and chatting to a few people some of the time. There are ways that we can do this, but we need to be immersed. We need to really understand what's going on for our audiences and our communities. And we need to think about that in a very empathetic way. Less about what's in it for us and more about what might be in it for them. Now, we kind of know this, but I think it is the starting point without which we can do nothing. Once we've done that, though, I think this should be a spur for us to creatively rethink our assets and develop what somebody else was talking to the other day called new ways in and new ways around. So, if we understand what's going on for our different audiences, and they are different, and we do need to think about different audiences with different needs, how do we use that as the trigger for our creative ideas and think about new ways in, new ways around? In some senses, there will be a marvelous wave of Gen Z artists and curators who'll have lots of lovely new ideas. But I think institutionally, that's not quite enough. We still need to think about how we make all the moves around the experience. We need to be ready, willing, and able to move with them at pace. How do we creatively rethink our assets and to be constantly thinking about new ways in and around? And one of the ways that we know successful organizations do, that the organizations that are successful at doing that is they learn by prototyping. So they do small, minimum viable versions of things in order to learn what audiences are really responding to. Many of you will know this. I can see people who I know have very embedded co-creative ways of working. You know that if you ask audiences or potential audiences or participants, well, actually, we really want to know what you want. And well, the first thing they come back and say, well, what have you got? Because actually, it's quite difficult for people to work with a completely blank piece of paper. If you want to get close to what really makes audiences tick, working with prototypes is a super way of getting into dialogue with people, really understanding what works, what doesn't work. And it can be the brokering of those conversations that you need to have. So we know that learning how to prototype and test as part of our everyday practice is the next really important part of it. So we've built the empathy. We've rethought what our assets could be. And now we're going to try out new things and new ways of doing things. It can be tiny things as well as great big new plans. But we do it with our audiences by using prototypes. And finally, we kind of introduce those new ideas into what we do, but we're ready to change them by keep on building in the feedback loop. So essentially, this is the kind of process we're trying to build more into the way we might think about audience developments. Not rocket science. We've all been talking about this for many years, but we are trying to get very practical about this in the playbook. Okay, so next up. I just mention again that an awful lot of our work is also based around evaluating how good people's audience development has been after 3 years, after 1 year on projects and so on. And I think it is also true that not only to say this is lovely theory, but we can actually see that those organizations who really manage to shift the dial it is because they are working in this way. They are definitely making experiences which start with audience need rather than starting with trying to sort of teach things around the edges to get them to come and do the things that you're already doing. We can see that that practice that's rooted in empathy is very, it's something to do. It's not just about the individual experiences. There's something about organizations which have empathetic brands, if you like, or they feel like places that have been thoughtful, even if it feels like it's been thoughtful for someone else. That seems to communicate an awful lot. We can see that those organizations are using data, but they're not using it in a crude way to try and paint by numbers. They're using it as to spark new ideas. I've got a lovely case study that we're not going to do today because today is a launch, but we will be coming on to it. Some great case studies that just show that thinking of data as not being a boring thing, but something which is like a spark, and that is the way of thinking about new ideas. I think that's the key thing. So, in order to help us to do that, in practical terms, we have gone back and looked at the practices of user-centered design at the core of the actual things that you need to do to get you there. So, as I said, we've thought about prototyping more baked into how we do audience development. We've thought a lot about how we get everybody involved in the right way all the time. And we've thought quite a lot about how you can build test and learn into just the way that we think about what audience development is. So audience centric, evidence-based, trying to think long term, trying to be joined up across the organization and indeed with our other stakeholders are important, and trying to build iteration into the way that we work. These are all the kind of ideas that sit behind it. So what is actually in it? So I've come up with a snazzy circle, which my colleagues for many years were going, oh, not the wheel again, Anne. But anyway, this is my lovely wheel that tries to fuse, if you like, some of our old ideas about audience development with this kind of more design thinking oriented way of imagining how we change with our audiences rather than just change for them. So it's broken into 4 different stages, very much like in following a kind of a general design thinking concept. So, as I say, it combines those traditional audience development framings, the ones we're used to, like the Ansoff matrix that we're just looking about, different kinds of growth and development with design thinking. Just for those of you who like a model, I apologize, lots of diagrams, but I do like a little bit of theory myself. And I just was going to say, so we spent a lot of time trying this out in different ways. But a lot of the tools are based on very well-known design thinking tools and techniques. We pick the most obvious and common ones in some ways. There's a plethora of amazing design thinking tools out there that you might get interested in using, but I think are very relevant. But we've tried to keep it very simple in the playbook itself. But essentially, this wonderful model that was developed by the Design Council some years ago imagines that designers do 2 things. They explore 2 different spaces. Firstly, they think about the problem space. What problems are we trying to solve? And then they start thinking about, well, and what solutions do we need to do? But it's very important that you think about these in 2 different phases. When you think about the problem space, first of all, you need to do what I was saying before, which is to kind of immerse yourself, divergent thinking, all the different things that could be going on for our audiences, what's happening there, before then coming in a little bit and saying, okay, right, so these are the things that could be going on. Let's think about what's most important. And I've thought about it from the point of view about what's most important for our organization that they can actually respond to, and actually what really matters to our audiences. So in a sense, we are at that point coming up with some sort of design brief for ourselves. So after the first part of the process, we're saying, so what's the design? We're going to design an experience for our audiences as part of the audience development cycle. What does it need to be? So in the second part, we're doing the same thing again, divergent thinking. What are all the possibilities? What might our audiences need for us? Let's test out some of those things. Let's be experimental and prototyping the way we think about that before saying, okay, we know these things are really working. So trying to build a little bit of testing, even if it's only getting a little bit of feedback from front of house as you go, how people are feeling about things, but building that idea of testing things out, lots of different possibilities, what's working well, and being very alert to what's working for our different audiences. So essentially, this is the rhythm we're trying to build into the way we think about audience development, and that's what's in the playbook. So it combines traditional audience development framings with design thinking. There are some tools, very specific tools to help you build empathy in there. There are some very basic outlines about how to do prototyping, what it is and how it works. Very simple stuff. There's a lot of background reading if you get into these things to go a little bit further. There's a sort of balance, I think, in the playbook about keeping it simple with introducing some of the core ideas. We know, for example, that a lot of co-creative practice, whether consciously or unconsciously, is really follows the principles of design thinking very, very brilliantly. And so sometimes people are very aware of the fact that they're working that way, and other times they're not. Um, we have thought, we're inviting people to think about the whole audience. When we talk about audience development, we have to be talking about the whole audience experience. And again, there are some tools and tips in there that are thinking about that. Although we have set it out step by step because we know that's what you need if you're really pushed, resourced and time-wise, you just want to go, just tell me the thing, what do I need to do? And what order do I need to do it? But we know in reality, you can dip in and out of this. You can start it and come back to it. It's really a reference lookup, the playbook itself. So it follows a step-by-step sort of cycle, but we know that you can and should be going backwards and forwards, learning a little bit more, trying a few things out. We shouldn't be afraid about kind of keep going around that circle all the time. And as we said, there's this idea about, building that a core part of it is building in the potential to review and adapt all the time as we go. So in stage one, in the discover phase, so just focusing on this a little bit, in each of the four stages, we're thinking a little bit about our organization and a little bit about our audiences to try and get that balance right. So in the discover stage, really starting off with and coming back to what does our organization really want to achieve and where do audiences sit in it? I think some of our issues do come from the fact that different people seem to think we're trying to do different things. So I'm very insistent we get this sort of joined up understanding about what it is that we're trying to achieve in terms of audiences. And then, but also it's that idea about let's just immerse ourselves in everything we know about audience. What's actually really going on? Who are our audiences? Who could they? Don't worry about just kind of collecting a massive data and having a little look at it at this stage. Just trying out a few different ideas, finding out what we can. So that's very much in the discover phase, and there's some tools and techniques in there for suggesting how you do that. The define stage, though, we're coming back away from the divergent thinking. Okay, so we've collected all this together, and here's the thing I think we often don't do, which is to say, now let's make some decisions based on what we know. So the first thing is we now know we have enormous ambitions as an organization. We probably can't do all those things, and we probably can't serve all those audiences in a very proactive way. So making some decisions about our specific goals, what we really think we can achieve with our with the resources available to us and the plans that we already have in place and the money that we have and the staff that we have. And think a little bit about our if you want to make real change, it's very hard to try and make change for everybody simultaneously. So perhaps prioritizing some specific audience groups. Alongside defining our needs, though, it really matters that we kind of drill down into what most matters for those key audiences. So again, it's taking the data we've got and saying, what are the plums we can pull out the data to help us understand what really matters to some of our audiences. So again, some of the tools are really designed around helping you to do that and to really focus as a group on what might most matter to certain audiences. So that's in the define stage. There we go. And then we move on to developing. So again, opening out again, thinking about more ideas, divergent ideas. So what might work in the future for some for those target audiences? Now, it may be a mix of the things we're already doing. That's great. Let's find out more about how they're responding to those things. It may be that we need to do some new things. But in this phase, we're thinking a little bit about what are we going to do for that those key target audiences that we've settled on, and how might it be different from what we've done in the past? And then on the audience side, we're thinking about perhaps involving those audiences more in how we develop that idea. So building in more testing, more prototyping, more working really closely with them. So we're starting to be able to listen to how they feel about the things that we're doing. Oh, lots of friends from Spain arriving. And finally, in our last session, in the last part of it, getting a little bit practical again at the deliver stage, we're starting now to think about operationalizing it. Of course, at some point we do fairly light touch, and we're not suggesting it needs a massive plan, but do you need to think a little bit about how we're going to do this? Who's going to do it? Do they have any resources that they have to have? It could be that you've got lots of limitations, so you have to sort of work with what you've got, or it could be that you're making a case for a larger budget to do certain things. So we need a bit of action planning here, old school stuff. But actually, the really critical thing for me is that we know what we're going to try and experiment with, and actually we build in that process of review, collecting feedback as we go. So this is something about making actually happen inside the organization. And again, there are some really simple tools here. You will all have probably much better ways of doing this, but some suggestions about doing that in very practical ways. Making sense so far? Any comments going, and shut up, what are you talking about? I didn't understand. I can't see them. Megan, Catherine? I'm taking good.
No, you're all good.
Good, right. Stunned to silence. Right. I should say, so in each of the sections, in each of these four sections, what you'll find is a short how-to bit like this one about, what could be in an action plan. It's suggestive rather than directional. And usually a few little tips and prompts to things to think through. There'll be others. And each of these little short how-tos has links to some of the templates and examples. So quite a lot of the bulk of the playbook is actually based around these things. So we've come up with a bunch of sort of planning tools. They do look a bit boxy, but they're sort of templates essentially that you can play with. You can make them look nice if you want to. But we've usually at the moment, we've got a couple of examples in there, but we're going to be working those examples out for different kinds of situations. So here's a persona planning canvas. You're taking some stuff that you know about a particular audience group and you're trying to now build some empathy around, imagining a real person. Here's some suggestions about how to do it. This is a famous empathy building tool that you can use. And here's an example, but there's also there's a sort of a downloadable kit that's got a blank version of all of these templates. So you could actually use it to build up your own sort of playbook. They're quite small, so you might have to use them you can make them bigger by putting them onto a whiteboard or actually using big sheets of paper and so on. But essentially, if you gather together a series of these different templates, you can sort of turn it into your own playbook as the general idea. And we've got examples, and as I say, we'll be kind of growing the example bank of those over time. It is worth saying you probably already picked up on the idea that the whole principle is based a little bit on the idea that the process really starts with thinking about the needs of a particular audience group. Once we're past discover, we have identified some particular audience groups that we want to focus on. And when I say audience group, it could be a kind of group, like a particular community that you've got some data about and you know that you really want to focus on. It doesn't have to be a fancy segment from a fancy segmentation thing, but we have organized it around imagining that you might be using our audience spectrum segments, partly because they're freely available to anybody to have a look at. There are tools to help you understand what segments live nearby. They're all free tools. So we've used that almost as a demonstration, but you could have any target group where you know something about those audiences and you're planning to find out about them over time. You can use it with other segmentation models. There are some really good ones out there, as you know. You can use it with any bespoke segmentation. And as I say, you can just use it with a key audience group that you know that you're interested in growing. Even if you know very little about them at the moment, you might build into your plan that you're going to try and build up some knowledge of them. With all of them, though, the idea of the cycle assumes that every time you do something or test something with that audience group, you are going to learn some more things about them. And we're really encouraging to say, so we'll review it, we'll capture the new things that we've learned about them, and we will build on the kind of the portrait that we have for that particular audience group over time. So we're kind of, as an organization or as a group of people, accruing the information over time as we test things out with them. The other simplification that it introduces is the idea of a sort of a very simple audience development mix. There are thousands of things, of course, we can do to engage our audiences, but we thought we sort of slightly contained them into sort of 3 Ps and 3 Cs, if you like, just to help us prompt when we're thinking about the wider way in which we might engage audiences. So we've got this idea of, broadly speaking, program, place, time, in other words, the whole environment that things sit around, and price in the very broadest sense, what that might mean, whether it's free or just the barriers it is to actually get our ticket, if you like, into something. And then we've thought more about, those are the sort of classic things that we tend to borrow from marketing. But actually, we've also thought about what we think about. There are many more C's as well, but we thought about obviously about communication is very important, but also these 2 dimensions around community. So we think that community building, whether that's thinking about how you can give and gain, whether it's you helping to broker a new community or helping to build a new community, or whether you are offering something up to a community in order that you are joining them and bringing your assets to the table. So quite a lot of thinking in the plays around how you can be builders of, contributors to, part of a community where you can make connections with those audiences. And then something around co-creative, where we're thinking around, if you want to really go on a journey with audiences, as we know, you need to kind of get up close and dirty with them and have real conversations. They've been making things together. So that might be about decision making. It might be about kind of creative opportunities and so on. So we've used these terms very loosely, but just as a trigger to try and think about, you probably need, if you want real change to happen, you probably need to be thinking across these 6 different dimensions. The things you're doing already might be fine. You can tick, tick, tick. but it may be that you see opportunities to work differently. And we're asking you just to sort of focus a little bit on each of those areas and go, no, we can't have the resources or time to do that, perhaps, or this is where you're going to put our energies because we think this could make all the difference. But based on some of the data that we've picked up. How am I doing? Oh, didn't quite well. Right. So by the end, in theory, you've got something pretty simple. Once you've gone through a bit of a cycle, it can be really in depth. It could be quite light. You could do this in a couple of afternoons, just making it up and then go back and backfill and start to find out a little bit more. You might end up with an overall strategy outline. What kinds of audiences are we trying to bring in, grow, diversify for what main organizational reasons? Somewhere that you've documented that and written that down. So which audiences and how, roughly speaking, are you going to know what success looks like? It can be pretty rough. You need some sort of timeline, how long are we going to try and do, what are we expecting to do when? I think that helps to galvanize whole organizations working together. It's very hard otherwise. We're assuming that you might end up with a little kind of suite of persona canvases where you thought about the different audience groups that you're trying to target and thought really carefully through what their needs might be and what you're going to do with them over time. We think that you probably need to have a little resource plan. Who's going to do what? If you need a budget, what partners you're going to work with, but essentially, how can we operationalize it? And finally, and importantly, as I said before, we'd really, the thing that we think is important is to say what kind of feedback and data you're going to collect, how you're going to evaluate it, and what's your forum going to be for keep on changing, keep on adapting and iterating. Now, I hope this doesn't sound too resource intensive because I think the idea is it can be as resource intensive as you need it to be. But essentially, we're imagining that these are the components of your own playbook, which this is a resource to help you to develop alongside your colleagues. And indeed, if you can involve your audiences in some of this, there are lots of opportunities to do that at various points as well. As I say, that is such a whistle stop. But we are going to be doing 4 deep dive workshops, which are free and hopefully you can make it. And we're going to tell you the dates of those if you want to get them in your diary. But look at, doing a really hands-on interactive version of this. As I say, this was just more of a little kind of taster session. So just to encourage you to go and have a little look at the playbook itself and to get your heads around that. So what's next? So I think at this point I should stop because we've got another 15 minutes. I've got a few I've got some things other things to talk about ways we can help and what's going to happen next and so on. But I would love to take any questions, comments, or thoughts at this point. Again, you can also get in touch with us in other ways afterwards. But if there's anything you would like to mention at the moment, please do. So I might just. I'll stay sharing, but I'll just have a look and see if I can find the chat. Yes, sorry, Dan. We will definitely one of those workshops will be all about doing prototyping. But I suppose it's worth saying one of the things we talk about. There are literally thousands of amazing resources out there. So we've tried to just sort of boil it down to some of the sort of the essentials. But I think one of the things that's really useful about thinking about prototyping is to think about it as being almost two-stage. So there is a kind of version of prototyping. It's literally just like a little sketch or just describing to somebody something that you might be thinking of doing. So so-called sort of lo-fi prototype. Just talking through some ideas with people. So that in a sense is a prototype. The next stage, you might want to work something up. And I think in our context, something like doing a scratch performance, for example, if you're a performing arts organization, or doing a kind of little mini version of things, or just an online version of something, where you're kind of trying to do the minimum viable version of something. But the important thing about it is really to understand how people are interacting with it. So whether you ask them questions about it and you have a sort of slightly formal sort of focus group or just chats with people about it, or or you have something that's in the foyer and people walk past and you ask your front of house team to have a chat with them about it, or whether you're actually observing how people interact with it. These are all, actually using a kind of half-made thing as a way of understanding what the risks might be, what the audience interaction is. That's the basic concept. The other important thing, of course, is also asking yourself as an organization how deliverable something is. So the idea really is to sort of lower the risk of trying to do new things, especially trying to do a lot of new things at once, by just kind of doing the minimum viable version of it. And there is quite a lot in the playbook about keeping it simple, but something along those lines. Okay. Yes, there is an example of the template for the final plan. I'm a little bit, I kind of didn't include it just there because it sort of it looks like a lot. But actually, my idea was, could you try and get a sort of summary version on one piece of A4? And I think you can, but that's a challenge that I'd love to challenge you to. I can because I know my own shorthand, but I'd love to know. Um, yeah, yes, indeed. Sorry, I'm just reading here. Well, Ben, I'm keen to reflect how we can align the entire end-to-end audience journey so that each touch point reflects and responds to our audience's newly defined needs. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of those interesting things. It's like there is a little bit in there about doing an audience journey map, because I think the other thing you can do is to sort of plot where you think your challenges might be as an organization, or certainly you could be looking, when you've got that trying to pull the plums out of the data pot that you've got. Sometimes one of the most useful things is understanding that you've got particular perhaps blockages somewhere in that audience journey. So I think that's one of the key tools, is thinking about, and again, we've done a very simplified version of it. There's a lot of great stuff out there about user journey mapping and how to understand, the issues around different touch points. But I think it's key, because I think what you're really looking for is a journey map for each of your core audience groups, an idealized one. But what would your ideal journey look like? Where do you think you need to make some improvements? Actually, what are their main channels going to be? That sort of stuff. So I think it's a really useful device, and we have suggested that that's one that you use. And again, it might be that you can't solve all the problems, you can't optimize it all straight away, but you have a plan over time to improve different touch points as you go. Yes, I'm going to do that, Georgina. I'm going to oh, hello. Yes, I'm going to show you those dates in a minute. It's my end piece, and Megan will send them, of course. John, that's a great question. How do we make sure it's representative of all segments? And I think that's the issue, isn't it? I think that in a way, what we're suggesting here is that the focus really is on deciding what your priority segments are, and making sure that you have a good enough version of a representative group of people that are talking about those things. And I think there's this sort of iteration between, one of the things that's been really interesting is we've done lots of these empathy building exercises that are usually done within the internal team. The one thing I would say is, if you've ever worked with a graphic designer, they love doing those exercises. But I think just doing, this is our made up, I won't name names, but I remember doing something with a very lovely theatre company a few years ago, and they invented someone who could not possibly exist, but they had to invent that person because that was their program that they had coming up. And it was such an interesting, but so one of the most important things, I think, and we do talk about this in the guide, is say, once you've come up with those ideas about who you think that audience might be and what makes them tick, is you must validate. And if all you can do, I mean, we've had some really creative ideas about going out, and one organization we know wanted to understand that they want to kind of get more public sector workers involved. They thought it was a really good route to get slightly less usual suspects into their organization. And so they set up a stall in the cafe of the local theatre, and they just said, "We're here from this organisation. We'd love to chat to you. We'll buy you a free cup of tea if you come and sit and talk to us." And they got loads of, so it doesn't have to be, it's that quality stuff is indicative. It's giving you clues. It's not quite like the full representative survey stuff. And I think what you want is the flavour and the feel. But I think it's super important. I think that's often what's missing from our sort of ticketing data only kind of models. And these are the sorts of things that I think we can really do some great deep diving in those sessions. And I'm hoping that what comes out of those will be able to sort of develop it as the resources as well. So that's great. Um, Oh, is there any advice on how many audience communities it's useful to end up with in the plan for context? I've got 16 audiences I'm researching and working with. Well, I think that is a brilliant question, Polly. Not least because I think that lies at the heart of many, many organisations' problems, doesn't it? And I think if you're a massive national institution that's really got behind this and put lots of resources to it, you could do 16 different audience groups if you really had to. Although I think you might start bumping into each other even then. But I think resource, time, energy, and prioritization are hugely important in that case. And I think for most organizations, three or four probably feels like a good place to start. So and it's not to say that you're not paying attention for those. It's really this is about being very proactive around the needs of certain audiences, isn't it? So it's like there's something about what is your bandwidth for proactivity, and actually how there's another measure as well, isn't there? How dissimilar are the needs of those different audience groups? And part of your exercise at the moment when you're looking at those 16 groups is probably to think, in fact, could I put some of those groups together? I know I think another project we worked on a few years ago with we were looking very specifically at families who were military families who we knew were very excluded and have a very particular need that this organisation could serve. But they realised that by doing a really, really focused exercise on the sort of the military families that were in the military base that in this town, they realised that the universal access issues that they were discovering that were very acute for military families actually work for all families. So there's something about judicious picking that relates to your strategy. And I think these tools are simple. It's the intelligence you bring to them that makes a difference. Okay. Yes. I think, Bryony, I don't want to have given the impression I'm suggesting that we're constantly moving on. I think the point really, I hope I don't know if that's what you mean, but I think the point for me is that it is about staying with those audiences for the long term and making a long-term commitment to them, but being ready to be adaptive around what's working for them all the time. So the long term is commit a long-term commitment to those audiences. The speed and adaptation is about working with them all the time, learning more about them, kind of getting closer to them over time. I hope that was clear. I think that's what is feels so important, building trust. Yes, 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 yes. And if I haven't stressed those things enough, thank you very, very much for saying it. I think that's spot on. Well, thank you very, very much, Ellie. Of course, I would expect you to say those things. That's just marvelous. I'm very glad that you have underlined it because it is super important. I'm not quite sure I said it loudly enough, both of you. That was a really, really, you see, just a little bit of interaction. We're going to have really good fun on these interactive ones. So do please think about coming along. It doesn't matter if there's loads of you because we'll do small groups and there'll be lots of chance to interact with each other and learn from each other as well. So would you like to know when they're happening? I'm now going to, am I still screen sharing? Got
Yes, you
no,
are.
completely lost it. Thank you. Right, great. Let me go back. So you see, it's so good when we talk. More to come. So there are the workshop dates. Megan will be very hot off the mark at sending you these dates soon as. So don't worry, but they are the 3rd of June, 7th of July, 16th of September, the 21st of October. I don't think you have to come to all of them, but you're very welcome to if you want to. There might be something, as we know, you're particularly interested in. There'll be a focus to each of them. And as I say, what we are anticipating is working in a very hands-on and interactive way, having a go at things, working out what doesn't work, where the barriers, and it all gets more interesting the more difficult it gets, as you know. As I say, we are working on some more extended examples that are more relevant to different kinds of audiences and different situations that will slowly start to roll out over time. We will also be looking at the connections between our audience spectrum tools and what's in the playbooks. At the moment, it's quite sort of, we're assuming you can do quite a lot of the joins yourself, but we'll be doing some more work on that over the year. Finally, please talk to us. I think I've said it 1,000 times already, but just let me say again, your feedback is very important. Megan is about to flash up a kind of pop-up survey, so if you can just bear it, any immediate thoughts. But of course, what we're really interested in is your feedback over time. Do just get in touch if anything occurs to you. We would love it. Particularly things, if you love things, of course, it's good to know. But if you have any things you really hate or find irritating, or you've spotted something that just doesn't work, we know there will be some of those things, and we are very keen to hear about them. What's missing, what else, etc. In the meantime, if don't forget that we do these things end to end with organizations. We do lots of training and mentoring in this area. We can help you with doing any of these things in your organization, but we can also help you just with the little things. A little bit of data here and there. Lots of these tools are free. Please don't hesitate to ask us. We've got lots of things that can help this process. We are always around, and we're very keen to support in whatever way makes sense. So I'm just going to say thank you so much for playing with me this afternoon. Come back and let's do some more, and let's get more interactive next time. Thank you so very much.